hear from 4 first-year advisors who teach AUX 1 as well as AUX 2 about how to bring anti-racist strategies into the classroom. So my name is Sarah Jones. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am racialized as Black, but I identify as biracial.
Hello, my name is Darian Smith. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am racialized and both identify as a Black and living in the US.
Hi, I am Esther Phillip. I use pronouns she, her, hers, and I am racialized as Asian, but I actually identify as Indian.
Hey, good morning, y'all. My name is Rachel Brown. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm racialized and identify as white. We also think it's important to honor our place in higher education, and so we want to acknowledge that this presentation is taking place on Native land, people who were part of the Piscataway tribe, and also, as mentioned by Elizabeth Rule in her great session on Indigenous pedagogy, this is just a starting point acknowledgement, and it's important for us to also think about action steps that we can take as well.
Alright, so we wanted to start off this presentation with getting us into a student activity. We're all coming from various places and various headspaces, and so we just want to make sure we all get focused in on what we're talking about in incorporating anti-racist pedagogies and why that's important here at AU. So we're going to watch a video that probably a lot of you might have seen already, but the Black Print here at AU did a video featuring some what are typically called microaggressions, but what we will position as racist acts that students experience in the classroom, but also based on other identities beyond race. So we'll take a minute to watch this video. It is tough to watch as there are very demeaning and dehumanizing things that are shared, but it's important to set the context for why this work is important for all of us in the space to partake in together.
I was in college writing my freshman year, and there was some weird noise coming from the heater, almost like steam coming out. And our professor said, "Damn, sounds like we're being gassed like Jews in Auschwitz." Oh my God.
A deep breath out, because that's heavy. And so I show that to my students in AUX2. I've taught it both in the fall and spring of 2019. And so each time I show it to them in the debrief that we have afterwards, what stands out to the students the most is that these aren't just things that they're experiencing on a peer-to-peer level, but they're things that they're experiencing from peer to faculty member and peer to staff members here on campus. And so this video was shot in 2018, produced in 2018, and it shows that we at AU we're harming our students, and so we need to do some digging and work to get to a place where we can stop causing this harm and stop replicating these systems that our students are facing. And so this is a little bit of what led us for up here to start to dig into the work, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But like I said, this was shot in 2018, and so yesterday we sent out the chapter reading that we'll get into more detail later. But we also got a reply back from someone who said they would not be in attendance today. And so without any identifying information, we're sharing just a response just to get us thinking of like, well-intentioned and good intentions can still lead us astray at sometimes, and so I just wanted to give you a second to read that, or I'll read it. As a white man married to a Black female immigrant, I am neither racist nor anti-immigrant. And to mitigate any potential adverse views with respect to racial topics or issues that might arise in my classes, I make my family status known at the outset. So this is interesting because it's a practice that you can bring into the classroom that you can intentionally choose to ground your class with. So this professor is saying that they make their family status known of being an interracial couple at the outset to kind of mediate any like racial conflict that could happen in the classroom. So just show of hands, do you all think this is a racist practice or an anti-racist practice? So racist practice, and then anti-racist practice. Any not sures or both? Okay. So we'll get into what it means to be anti-racist in a little bit, but we want to give you all a chance now to bring in your own practices that you do. And so I'll let Esther.
Okay, so before we get into this, we want to name that we're not situating ourselves as the experts of anti-racist experts on this campus, because we know there's a lot of people that do that work. We are just lifelong learners that are very passionate about this work and know that anti-racist work can be done in our positions of power wherever we're working in, and so that's why we wanted to continue this conversation. So we'd like for y'all to think about getting thinking and talking with one another about this. So thinking about your beliefs, values, biases, and practices surrounding race in your everyday work, we would like you to find a partner near you, sitting near you. How do you incorporate race discussions into your work with your students? And then after, I want you to think about how do you incorporate race discussions with work with your colleagues. So think anti-racist practices. Did I say racist? I very much so meant anti-racist practices. So yeah, you can find a partner. Break up beautiful conversation that is flowing and going well, but we're going to continue the conversation. But if I can get some people that are willing to share out some ways they incorporate with their students or colleagues anti-racist practices.
Okay. Sure, my name is Lawrence Green. I'm a videographer, editor, podcast producer, and I try to incorporate anti-racist practices in my own little way at my job by trying to ensure that diverse faces are shown in the videos that we produce, and also incorporate topics around diversity and underrepresented topics that may interest or benefit underrepresented groups in my job, or for the podcasts that we produce.
Hi, I'm Ashika. So my colleague Sonia and I talked about our names, actually. And so I'm Ashika, but I go by Ash to a lot of people here. And it's just, so she asked me why I do that. And that's kind of one of the practices we talked about was she consciously talks to her students about their preferred names and what they would actually like to go by. And I kind of feel like it's a lot of labor trying to get people to pronounce my name right. And so I just go by Ash. And it's just easier, like personally, to do that. And I don't know what other students' preferences are. So, thank you.
Hello, my name is Robert Randolph. I am the Assistant Director for the Writing Center here at the university. And we specifically incorporate readings and training that help students, our tutors, critically think about how we use language and how that language is English, is used to oppress and to get students to think about their identities through their language. So that's how we use it.
Because of time, we're going to continue, but I promise we will continue to talk about this more. And thank you for sharing.
All right, so now we're going to get into some definitions. So I kind of gave you a trick question because we haven't laid out definitions beforehand. So there are multiple definitions out there for what it means to be racist or anti-racist, or to practice racism or to practice anti-racism, but the ones that we're using for our presentation today are: racism is the belief in the inherent superiority of one race over all others and thereby the right to dominance. Whereas anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism. So active process of identifying and eliminating the belief of the inherent superiority of one race by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. So the reason we chose this definition in particular is because it focuses in on like it being an act, and so you have to do something to change the current system, as the current system is the status quo of racism. But also you have practices and attitudes, and so a lot of times anti-racist work can feel like it needs to only be at the higher policy level, where a lot of us, like the four of us, don't have a lot of access to direct policy, but the access that we do have is to the individual policies and practices and attitudes that we do bring into our classroom spaces and into our advising spaces. And so we're arguing that everyone here has individual practices and individual policies that you have power over students, and so you have a responsibility to identify and eliminate any racism by changing any of the structures and systems that are at play. And so to make that a little bit more tangible, so the chapter that we pulled the book from, once again, we'll explain that more in our later in our presentation, gave 4 concepts to really make this work tangible for you to do. And so 1, rejecting false notions of human difference. 2, acknowledging lived experiences are shaped along racial lines. 3, learning from diverse forms of knowledge and experience. And then 4, challenging systems of racial inequality. And then this quote from Ajuma Oluo, or this tweet, really sums up nicely of the beauty of anti-racism, is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. So anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward. So you're not going to do anti-racist work and then all of a sudden you're never going to be racist again, like we're all socialized in a racist society. So to eradicate that completely is a lofty dream, it's a goal, and it's an aspiration. But the reality is you just need to be ready to face it when you find it coming up in yourself, when you find it coming up with your colleagues and with your classroom spaces that you have access over.
So the 4 of us began to ask ourselves, how could we really commit to practicing these anti-racist actions? What could that look like? And last year in the spring, a white first-year student used the N-word directed towards Black students, and we were very frustrated by that and felt that we had failed our students in our classroom, especially after discussions that we had about the racist incident. So we wanted to know what we could do in order to be better anti-racist practitioners. So over this past summer, we brainstormed ideas and we met with Amanda Taylor, and she suggested that we use the book Everyday Anti-Racism and go through different chapters together, the 4 of us plus another colleague who was employed at AU at that time. And so we met weekly for 30 minutes to go through each of these chapters. We picked out different chapters that we felt were pertinent to our work and discussed different strategies that we could implement. And so this is known as a community of practice, when a group of people who share a common concern come together to talk about it and how to develop this practice. So a community of practice has 3 different components. One is the domain, or whatever the interest is. So for us, it was anti-racist practices, specifically thinking about curriculum, pedagogy that we could implement in our classes and in advising sessions. And then our community over the summer was the 5 of us who are all higher educational professionals, all first-year advisors and AUX instructors. And then as a practice, we would exchange different resources, information, stories, experiences that we had with students over the past year throughout our lives, in order to be able to learn from each other. Again, going back to that lifelong learner concept, to be able to learn from each other how we could be better practitioners in this work. And one really cool thing was that the 5 of us implemented it this summer, and then we decided, our office decided to roll it out to everyone who is associated with first-year advising. So now we actually have 5 different communities of practice that we put together, and we all meet about twice a month to go through a different chapter in this book and talk about how the concepts relate to the work that we're doing.
So at the end of each of the essays in the book, Everyday Anti-Racism, there are 3 questions that are asked: the principle, the strategy, and the try tomorrow. So the principle is kind of about the concept of the essay and kind of thinking about the concepts that were discussed. The strategy is thinking about how to maybe implement it, and then try tomorrow is really pushing you to figure out a way for you guys to implement it into your roles in the classroom or in your role at AU. So if I can hear from some of the groups about their answers to the principal question, which of the 4 agreements of courageous conversation might you find the most beneficial when talking about race? Is there any groups that would like to share out?
Hi, I'm Roshan. I'm in first year advising, teaching AUX1 and AUX2. The one we talked a lot about was being okay with discomfort and being able to sit with discomfort. Recognizing that these are difficult conversations, and actually making that explicit, saying that this is going to be a difficult conversation. There are going to be times where it's painful. There are going to be times where you feel really uncomfortable or defensive. And we should recognize that and also be able to sit with that and think about, where does our discomfort come from? What's being challenged that makes us feel this way?
Yeah, it's really interrogating yourself. Thank you, Roshan. Any other groups? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Wade. I'm in the biology department. We talked about that, but then we also talked about accept a lack of closure, right? This, considering that these all reflect like our upbringing and our background, and a lot of these are just biases that we may not even realize we have, that's talking about we're not going to get closure on this in one day, that this has to be a continuing conversation, that this is not something that can just be settled and then, hey, we can move on and everything's great. But, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a bit, but talking about that, accepting a lack of closure, you can also use that to highlight that this has to be an ongoing process that you take with you throughout your life, because these situations come up in new and uncomfortable and completely novel ways for a lot of people, and you have to realize that you can't just carry yourself and be like, oh, I'm not a racist, it's done. So.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for sharing that. I think it definitely alludes to the concept of lifelong learning, for sure. Any other hands on the principal question of the year? Thank you. That's okay, you can go behind you.
We spoke a lot about the speaking your truth portion of it, because I feel like we all were in agreement that we don't start from the same page. A lot of people come at it from like completely different contexts that are not, we don't know everything, and we don't know what's right and what's wrong in a different context. So being able to speak your truth and kind of acknowledge that, this is where you are, this is what you think, and, that acknowledging that there's always room for improvement and always room for like learning and growing, but having like a baseline understanding of where the participants in the discussion come from in terms of where their truth is, I think we felt was important.
Definitely. Thank you. All right, so let's move on to the strategy piece. How would talking about race strengthen and or complicate your approach to teaching? And then we have two parts to that question down here. In what ways could discussing race be a racist act? And in what ways could discussing race be an anti-racist act? So maybe this could also be some time for you guys to think about that email that we showed up at the beginning. Any groups want to say?
So one of the strategies that I saw, it connected discomfort and speaking your truth. And it was that so I went to a very white male Christian majority undergraduate where people were stuck with the discomfort of feeling attacked on the flip side, where the white men were feeling like the words white male privilege were thrown around, and they came into the discussion feeling like the enemy, which really halted a lot of the conversation. And so acknowledging that some students were willing to speak their truth, saying that as a white male, their friend was murdered by a gang who were racist against white men. He's like, I don't want to feel like the enemy in this discussion because I've been the victim at the same time. So acknowledging all the complexities really helped further the conversation and allow people to feel represented when the goal is to make sure everyone feels represented in the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Any others? Oh, we have one in the back, Darren.
Hi, Nate Harshman from physics. One challenge, certainly in the STEM disciplines, we are a discipline that has a history of not having a representation that reflects our national or international population, and this is something then that we talk about as a discipline, but I think sometimes it's hard to talk, or we have to be careful when we talk about that. There's a well-known phenomenon of stereotype threat, where if you sort of say like, oh, well, women and minorities don't do as well on standardized tests right before you give the standardized test, then you can show that that has a detrimental effect, even though if you do the control, there was no effect. So stereotype threat, for example, is something to watch out for as a racist ramification of trying to be anti-racist. Maybe.
And also just acknowledging the racism that is in standardized testing as well, and that when we see those discrepancies, that's going to be due to racism and not differences between racial groups.
All right, we have two others. Oh wait, Amanda, sorry.
Hey, no, thanks. And I wanted to sort of go back to some of the themes we just heard and talk about the distinction in my mind that emerges from this in separating, making space for people in classes and people's experiences as true, but also parsing out ideas, right? So a sort of racist idea, right? You can be as an individual a victim of violence, right? If you are white, you can be a victim of violence, right? But the question is, does that mean that racist violence, which is predominantly targeted towards folks of color in this country, is not true? No, right? So how do we really make sure that when we're having these conversations, we hold space for individuals' human experiences, but challenge ideas that trap all of us, right? Some of which ultimately kind of flatten people's experiences and are sort of counter to what we know empirically is systemic and structural violence against people of color and other minoritized groups in this country, right? So I think how we respond to people's lived experiences, depending on where they're coming from, is key, that we honor the truth of humans, but we also challenge ideas within them that could be, in fact, promoting racism, ultimately. So I think that's key. And I wonder if I can ask y'all as a group, because you mentioned, Sarah, when you talked about this, that you were thinking back to that first email that y'all sent. I wonder if you could say a little bit about your intention there and kind of what you were thinking and how, in your mind, that ties to your strategy. Not to take us off base, I know there's other folks, but I'm just curious about that too.
No, you're fine. Do you mean the email that we sent you, everyone yesterday with the chapter?
First email that y'all opened that I think wrote earlier.
Oh, okay. The email that we got back?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we sent the email with the chapter yesterday, and we received the email back. And the reason why we wanted to include it in our presentation today was because the Blackburn videos from 2018, which hopefully people have seen before and people are aware of microaggressions that are happening on campus. But we also wanted to show that this is something that happened just yesterday. A faculty member had sent this to us saying, these are the reasons I believe I'm not racist, and then kind of went into, I am curious what your opinions are on this, and sent multiple emails actually. So we wanted to show that it's an ongoing thing, and again, that we need to be addressing it, not just because, students addressed it back in 2018, but these are still issues that are relevant on campus today. And then Esther would like to contribute more.
Another thing to add about that email, I could see how his approach, it was a practice to show, hey, giving my positionality, this is my life, and I can see power in that of doing that. But for him to end it up that makes him anti-racist and anti-immigrant, and that's the only way and approach. Just because you're surrounded by people, even for me, even though I'm surrounded by people of color, it doesn't make me anti-racist. It's my actions, it's my continuous thing, and me just showing a picture of my brown family doesn't mean I'm anti-racist. So I think that's kind of where, yes, it could lead to good intentions and practices of showing who I am in the classroom and what my positionality means in regards to my material and what that means for us as you learn in my space, but also in the fact of it needs to be ongoing, and me just showing that can't be the only thing.
We also want to challenge the idea of not racist and how that's not really a thing, and that we are either racist or anti-racist in our actions. And so when someone talks about being not racist, Dr. Kendi in his book, How to Be Anti-Racist, talks a lot about how that's not a good term to use. And is actually avoiding using the term not racist is a good first step towards being anti-racist.
So I think for the interest of time, we're going to keep moving on in our presentation, but there will be more time for you guys to talk again about that one last question that I discussed, the try tomorrow.
I just mentioned this book, but here we are again. So in the introduction, Dr. Dr. Kinsey uses this quote to say that anti-racism really focuses on how we develop a self-awareness, how we are self-critical, and then also how we examine ourselves. And I know I have to think about all the times that I have messed up in this work and be very critical with myself. And so we believe that this is really the core of anti-racism, is being critical with ourselves and learning from each other as a community. And we think that having these communities of practice that we talked about is a good way for us to hold each other accountable, but also love each other as well and show that we care for each other in the actions that we're taking.
So as promised, I said you guys would get back to discussing more questions. So up here we have 2 try tomorrow questions. So we actually do want you guys to discuss it in pairs. So what self-examination will you commit to doing while engaging in anti-racist work with your colleagues? And then what is one anti-racist strategy you could commit to doing in your role at AU? So discussing those amongst one another, and then we'll come back as a large group, please. Hey, can we come back together as a whole group, please? Thank you, Roche. All right, so before we hear from you all, we did want to put up on the screen some ideas that we had for you all to be anti-racist in your classrooms, in your role at AU. This also pertains to us as well. So the first 5 that we have listed up here really pertain to teachers in the room, anyone who's in the classroom. So something that you can do is acknowledging the native land on which AU is built, which is something that Rachel did at the beginning of our presentation. Naming your race in the classroom, and this goes beyond all different types of disciplines that are here at AU. Setting up your room in a way that breaks down power dynamics, creating brave spaces, giving positionality of identities, and then finally that last one is more about policies here at AU. So these are some of the ones that we came up with as a group. I know that Esther has some that she also wants to contribute that she heard this morning, but we also want to hear some that you guys had as a large group too.
Fresh off the press, actually, from like students that I was talking to, like that were in MGC and stuff. Some of them were saying how they wish they had mid-semester feedback check-in, so then that way that's a moment they can have a conversation about how the classroom is going or things that are thing, and something simple, right? And so things that we think about a lot, but like a lot of them were expressing that they felt this in a lot of their classrooms. So not tokenizing like a specific group, like if you're giving an example of a specific group and then you look to that one person that identifies that but may not actually identify in that, and going to them to talk about it. Also the things about like, for example, they were like not othering races, like so for example, why does African American literature be a separate course? Why can't it be part of just literature? Why can't it be integrated for who you're including in your examples, who you including in your readings and things like that. Another thing they kind of brought about is like about textbooks that aren't really used often, but then for socioeconomic status and stuff like that, like they're spending all this money, if there's a way that maybe we could provide some of the readings if we're not really using the full textbook and stuff like that, and making it more accessible. Even timing of when we give the syllabus can impact them of when they have to buy it, because if they're not getting money, not getting paid until like 2 weeks later, but then they have they got the syllabus the first day, but then 4 days later they got 4 chapters to read and they don't have the book yet. That impacts, right? So it's simple things like that. And like being open to questions and understanding situations and having that open door. And then these are things like we all talk about and know, but it's still impacting our students that they still feel that is not really being done as a wide practice. So do any of y'all have any other anti-racist strategies that you can use in your role, whether a teacher or staff, anything?
I was actually wondering if you could explain 3 and 4 a little more. I'm intrigued by those, but I don't know what they are.
Yes. Okay. So set up for the room in a way that breaks down power dynamics. One strategy that can be, I hate this style of this, because what this does is that it puts a barrier between the learners and as if I'm authority of expertise, right? But if I have a circle, not that every classroom has the ability to do this, but if I'm able to make a circle with my students, that breaks power dynamics, that we're all learners, we all learn from each other, and that like I'm sitting with you and I'm learning from you just as much as you're learning from me. So that's one way that can kind of break down power dynamics. And so the setup of a room can make a difference. Creating brave space, what that means, there's a term called safe space, there's terms hostile spaces, you know, space, just regular, but what a brave space differs from a safe space is a safe space people feel, you know, like literally safe. I'm not being threatened, I'm not, no one's coming at me or anything, but a brave space is a space where it's next level to safe space. I feel safe, but I feel that I love you enough that I can challenge what you're telling me, that we can have a conversation to understand each other. We're coming from differing things, but we can challenge each other, but still feel that I'm not going to get repercussions or consequences for me saying something against you and us differing. So that's what differentiates a brave space versus safe space. Yes.
Would you recommend, like, putting this right in the syllabus, like saying, like explaining what a safe space and a brave space are, and saying this classroom is a place, please do this? Is that something that people have done, or?
I definitely think that could be a method. I know for me, I do describe what I want, like when I want a brave space, but I also have to make sure I'm doing what I can on my part in creating a brave space. There's a lot of literature around, well, some literature that I did, I don't know if there's a lot, but there's some literature around in creating brave space, so it has to be an active duty on me to continuously to build that, and for them to also understand what that would mean in the classroom.
Thanks, I'm John, I teach in SOC, and this is all deadly serious, somewhat the emphasis on deadly, and it's very helpful, but what I found also is having a sense of humor, but I only directed at myself, so I started saying to my classes, I'm an old black guy from New England, and if we had feelings in Connecticut, we certainly wouldn't discuss them. So that kind of breaks the ice, and then I'm goofing on myself, and I'm not saying any of this is funny, but if I poke that fun at myself, I found that loosens things up a little bit. And I was talking to Sherburne about this, and I got this in another seminar. I've stepped on a couple landmines, and the best thing to do, I've been told, is just own your own stuff and apologize. I don't remember your first name, but it's Ohio State.
Oh, me? Oh, Brian.
Yeah, Brian, but I remember that, and I asked him that, and he said that. I don't remember you going to Ohio State, but that was helpful too, because I have, you know, again, at my age, I don't know, and a quick example is, where are you from? Well, off campus, that's nothing. On campus, that's a big thing, and I was told explicitly why, but that was very helpful. So just, you know, I'm sorry, who knew? So I'm learning a lot. Anyway, but the humor does help.
Thank you. My name is Anselm Beach. I'm a student and a staff. I was a student first, and now I work full time here at the School of Education. And so I think that, like, in our conversation here, even something I've been thinking about a lot. I love how you guys made the distinction between being not racist and being anti-racist. I think one is very passive, and in the definition that you put up of anti-racism, it's very active. And I think another thing that's also very active, which you brought up, Sarah, is it? Or Rachel. I was like, it's one of the, I know you're Esther, Rachel, Sarah, and then Dan. I'll remember that later. But no, I think one of the things that you brought up, Rachel, was about love. And I think love is also something that's very active. And I think one of my favorite definitions of love, and this is a number of different things, but it talks about how love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. And I think personally for myself, I think that, like, it's 2020, people are getting a lot more aware of race and how people of color or people who have been marginalized due to race, how that's felt. So they're giving them a lot more space and a lot more power to be able to talk about these things and share about these things. But I think that again, within this concept of racism, there is this dynamic around power, and I think power does not need to come at the expense. I believe that power does not need to come at the expense of another person. By that I mean that like marginalized people being able to use their power to speak up about their marginalization do not need to marginalize others in that same process. And so I think that's where the whole patience and trust and hoping and persevering, kind of going back and forth between having multiple conversations about these things, I think it leads to there being that more that greater balance and equity in the conversation around race. So yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Eugen, she, her, hers. I do substance abuse work on campus. And I was thinking, I really appreciate that point from my friend, but I just forgot your name right now.
No, Anselm.
Anselm? I'm gonna get it right. So I was thinking about, when you brought up the concept of love, about Bell Hooks, who wrote a book called All About Love, which fundamentally changed the way I think about love, and also how we prioritize romantic love as well. And a core part of her definition of love is actually about accountability, and that love is not always about feeling good and being comforted. And so I thought about power dynamics, not only in room spaces, but also within interactions. And so recognizing that we are in a privileged position among students and whoever we are working with, and a lot of times there's ego involved, right? And when we're being called out, when it feels like, oh no, that's not what I meant, I really meant this, like I'm not a bad person. And so I think being aware, I think I've heard a lot of feedback, well, how do I know how to do better if my students won't tell me? And so do you create a space where your students can share it with you? A lot of people think that they are good at taking feedback and then show otherwise. So I think it's just being real with yourself. In what ways do I find defensiveness in being called in? In what ways does that reflect the way I feel about myself, right? And so I think it's building an environment of trust where you can also kind of let your mask down in a way that shows your students, I make mistakes too. And also last point being in power dynamics, there's a difference between disagreement and having complex conversations about race and dehumanization, right? And so who holds the burden of having to placate certain feelings and conversations that really are about dehumanization, which personally I won't tolerate. Thank you.
Thank you.